Hello, and welcome to the Physical Therapy Owners Club podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Shields, and today I have Dr. Jenna Gourlay. She's a physical therapist, but co-founder of Professional Rebellion with a prior podcast viewee that I had, Phil Plisky. She's a team physical therapist for the University of Evansville women's basketball and volleyball teams, as well as a staff physical therapist at Pro Rehab Orthopedic Physical Therapy.
Yes.
Okay, I got through that. All right, cool. Jenna, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Cool. Well, I was intrigued and interested to talk to you today because you did a recent article in Impact Magazine about having difficult conversations. And
Yes.
It's something that I don't know if I've really touched on it that much in the number of episodes that we've done in the podcast. You know, we talk about many different business matters, but we don't really talk about how to have some of those difficult conversations, or what the mindset should be and how to prepare for them.
Yes.
I think this could be a really valuable episode, so I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but before jumping into that, tell us where you're coming from. What's your professional path and got you to this point?
Yeah, so I initially started out as a PE teacher. I went back to school for physical therapy. I did a sports residency, and then after I finished that, I am still in the sports residency. So I am now a clinical mentor working with our residents in the clinic. So that's where I'm a PT as well. I work with the women's basketball and the women's volleyball team. So a big part of my passion is in sports physical therapy. And then a few years ago, Phil and I founded and started the Professional Rebellion, which is where most of my passion is right now, especially for physical therapy, just trying to help others create the career that they want in the profession. Because there are so many awesome things we can do in PT, and there is really no limits to what it can be unless we put limits on ourselves. So our whole goal is to help people figure out their own path and their own really ideal career within the profession.
Well, and that's cool. And people should listen to Phil's episode that I did with him. I think it's maybe 2 or 3 episodes behind this one, where we talked about, burnout in the profession and what leads to that. And it's usually related to physical therapists not really acting out into their purpose, essentially. And that's essentially what Professional Rebellion is doing, I'm assuming, is helping physical therapists figure that out.
Yes, exactly.
Cool. Well, talk to us. What got you to this? What was the inspiration to write up the article and throw it out there for Impact Magazine?
I think a big part of our profession is communication, whether it's with patients, whether it's with coworkers, or whether it's with other employees that we work with. And I don't know that we talk enough about it, because there are so many hard issues in day-to-day things and just over the course of the career that it's almost like I feel like people are constantly trying to avoid these conversations. They don't want to have them. I know I have done the exact same thing in the past, because we see it as this like point of, it's either going to go well or it's going to go bad. And if it goes bad, it's going to ruin the relationship. And you just start making up all these, worst case scenarios in your head that a lot of times you don't even have the conversation to begin with. And I think I want to really change that narrative, because I think these conversations are actually ways to improve relationships, even if they're hard conversations, just as long as we approach them in certain ways.
Well, I think it's necessary for physical therapy owners, because one of the things I believe holds us back is we're, in a way, maybe as a profession, people pleasers.
Yes.
And we want to maintain that friendship. We want to maintain the alliance and the camaraderie. And we know that's relatively vital as a team and as an organization. But if we're not getting to the heart of certain matters, if we're not willing to confront, if we're not willing to hold accountable, then our businesses are really going to suffer. There's going to be a lot of people falling by the wayside. What's that called? What's the opposite of retention?
Burnout, or
or they're going to fall out, right?
They're going to leave.
There's going to be turnover, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so, but the hard part is we don't have training per se
Right.
on how to have these conversations. We could bring that up in a way that comes to us naturally, but maybe it comes across too harsh. Maybe it's not hard enough. Maybe. And so because we don't have a lot of training on these crucial conversations, you call them crossroad conversations, then it can be really difficult for us to even do anything. And maybe we just get stuck in paralysis. Well, maybe it just all blows over and everyone stays happy, but that's probably the worst thing to do, is to not say anything, right?
Right. That period where you're not saying anything, it's, yes, you're not having the hard conversation, but a lot of times you're ruining a relationship even more, because sometimes things that are left unsaid, one, things aren't changing if you want change, and two, if you're feeling a certain way, you're not doing anything to resolve those feelings. So it's almost like you're just letting them almost control how you feel and how you're moving forward.
Yeah, it's so much easier. And I see this in clients who are willing to have the conversation, the hard conversation, and just get it over with it and say their piece and move on, compared to those who don't have the conversation. The progress of those that have the conversations is significantly greater than those that don't, simply because they address the matter and they move on. And by having that, what needs to be said gets said, what needs to be addressed gets addressed, and then both parties seem to be on the same page, or they at least know where both of them are coming from, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So how can you help us? Tell us a little bit about maybe mindset or thoughts we should have before we go into these conversations. How should we prepare ourselves?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest way that we can prepare ourselves and we can get ready for these conversations is to recognize that there are different perspectives. So the way that we're looking at whatever the situation is and the way that the other person is looking at the situation, very rarely do those two things line up, because if they did, we wouldn't have to necessarily have that conversation in the first place, right? So one of the things that they talk about a lot in, if you've ever heard of the book, the Hard Thing About Hard Things, it's a great book if you haven't read it. But one of the things that they talk about is how we often create stories that aren't necessarily based on facts. And one of the best examples that I can think of right now for this is we often all eat together at work, and it's a way that we kind of can get to know each other as individuals, as people, when we're not worried about patients, and we're not on thinking about what we're doing next, but we can just be ourselves. And it's a really nice time, and a lot of people stay, and it's how we build that relationship. Well, we had somebody new come on that never stayed for lunch, and you could just tell that the relationship wasn't forming, that they weren't feeling comfortable, and she just didn't feel like she was fitting in. And I sat down to talk to her about it, and I have this whole story in my head, like, she doesn't like us for some reason, and she doesn't feel comfortable in the place that she's at, and maybe this wasn't the right fit for her. I have this entire narrative. And I sit down with her and confront her about it, and she says, well, I feel like no one likes me. And we're having very similar thoughts, but my perspective is she doesn't like me. Her perspective is, no one likes me here. And for that reason, she's leaving at lunch. It's the same behavior either way, but it's much different. So it's kind of like, a lot of times you both have a thought. It's not necessarily right or wrong, but it's based on a story that you've created yourself rather than the facts that are there.
Yeah, my wife alluded to this the other day. Not that we were having any issue, but we were talking about the concept of, I think Brene Brown brings it up, in that she'll start a conversation with, the story that I'm telling myself right now is blank. And that's how she'll start the conversation. Not that the conversation needs to start that way, but maybe understanding that we have a story going on that might not be reality.
Yes.
Right.
So that's, I think, a huge thing, is just recognizing that there are different perspectives, and that where you're coming from might not be where that other person is coming from. And then the response to that is, then when you go into these conversations and when you have these hard talks, is to actually be more curious than anything else, to ask questions, to try and see where that other person is coming from. Because if that's the case and you have a completely different story in your head, you can start to reshape that and change that.
Yeah, I learned a lot about simply being curious, and what's the mantra, first seek to understand before being understood, or something like.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, seek for understanding. It might be a Covey thing, Stephen R. Covey thing, but first seek for understanding. So be curious. And what I've been instructed to do is avoid the why questions,
Mm-hmm.
because that immediately puts the other person into a defensive posture to explain themselves
Mm-hmm.
and support their opinions, and even entrench them, maybe even more. But help me help me understand what's
Mm-hmm.
happening when this, or what's going on when I see this, or what are you thinking about blank, are different ways to approach the
Yes.
same question and get some understanding and help both parties be on the same page. Is that something that you've also talked about or trained?
Yeah, absolutely. That's like a huge part, is just not asking why. Because like you said, that is automatically, it's like something is ingrained in us where we're like, if they're asking why, I did something wrong. So reframing that question and just trying to get to, the true reason is huge in that.
Yeah, because it's really helpful to carry on the conversation once you know exactly their thinking process.
Mm-hmm.
And usually it's not as horrible as you think that it
Right.
is. Maybe you have to ask a few more questions to really get to the heart of it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still kind of a learned thing. It's not something that comes naturally.
Mm-mm.
And so is there any further preparation that you recommend people go through?
One of the things you also want to think about before you go into these conversations is how you can be transparent about what you're talking about.
Okay.
So, let's say that you are having a conversation, and a really tough one to have is if an employee isn't performing to what you really need them to do.
Okay.
Maybe they're not seeing a high enough capacity. And that's a hard conversation to have, especially if you're talking to, an employee that feels like they're working really hard.
Yeah.
And, how can you be transparent? Well, a way that you wouldn't necessarily be transparent is to, sit down, say, you really need to get your numbers up. You need to do X, Y, and Z. Do you think you can do that? Well, that might help the problem really in the short term, but long term, that's not necessarily going to incite change. So a way to be transparent might be to, discuss where that person is in comparison to the rest of the team, and frame it more from like a teamwork perspective, or to, show actually what the billing is and how it's reimbursed and how certain things affect, their capacity and things like that. But just telling what to do and just, trying to come up with solutions is great. But if you're not giving all the information and you're not getting it all out there, sometimes it can feel almost like you don't care as much, or you're hiding something, even though you're probably not hiding anything. You just think you want to tell them what they need to know, and they need to know that they need to get their numbers up. But that person on the other end of it may be receiving something completely different.
Yeah, I think it goes back to being transparent, especially about the numbers. And not to say that you have to show them exactly how much money you're making as an
Right.
owner, but I remember specifically I had a conversation with a therapist who had been out quite some time, and she'd been with me maybe a year or two, and it was going into our summer season, which is typically slower in Arizona. And I was worried about the numbers, and I said, hey, we might be down to this number next week, this number of total visits this next week. And she had no emotion. She didn't know if she was supposed to be excited about that or if she was supposed to be worried about that. And I recognized that I'm the only one that holds those numbers in. I'm not sharing them. I'm not saying this is what minimum expectations are. This is our break-even point. This is where we need to be, or else the business will fold. I'm not having those conversations as a young business owner. And then I recognized the light bulb went off. Like, I need to share this information with the others so they know when we talk about numbers exactly what that means for our business. And so do you find that if you talk more about the data, that it helps the conversation go along a little bit more smoothly and more objective versus subjective?
Yes, exactly. Because again, if we go back to that story, without that concrete data, that employee that's sitting in front of you is starting to formulate some sort of story based on what you're asking, right? So the story, you might be the best business owner ever, but if that employee doesn't have, a concrete example, they're thinking like abstract, and that's hard to grasp sometimes. So they may be thinking, well, I'm figuring out what I make and probably what we get reimbursed, and it seems like enough, so they must be trying to take advantage of me. When in actuality, you have, the front desk staff, and you have, you got to buy all this other stuff for the clinic, and you have all these other things, but that person doesn't have the context for that.
Yeah.
So the less information you give, the more opportunity you give that other person to fill in the details to how they're perceiving it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and that was one of the first examples you shared in the article about an owner who's struggling financially, and how transparent the owner needs to be about the finances in general, and what will keep their business afloat and versus what might sink them. And that, I guess, those were really hard conversations that a lot of owners could have had during the pandemic, to really help employees know what's happening and not leave them in the dark, because they're simply going to work out of uncertainty, and that leads to fear, and that leads to rumors, and that could be bad in general for the morale of the clinics, right? Whereas an owner that said, listen, this is what it's done to us thus far. This is where we need to hit to break even. What we're looking at going forward is we're going to apply for these loans, and I think that's what you're talking about, transparency in that regard, right?
Yeah, you don't need to, show every little thing, but you do need to give enough that your employees and that the people that you're working with understand where you're coming from.
Definitely. And so how do you what if it's something more like an employee that's acting maybe not inappropriately, but bad behavior or something like that in the clinic? How would you recommend you approach something like that? That's not necessarily data related,
right?
It's not necessarily related to their performance per se as a therapist, if that's what they were,
right?
But just their interactions with the other team members.
Yeah. So a good example of this could be like if you have someone that, maybe isn't quite happy at work, we all go through periods of times, and, one negative person can really take down the entire culture of where you're at. And let's say, just to speak an example, say you have that person and you want to talk to them about how negative they are and the things that they're saying that, that are affecting everyone around them. The biggest thing you want to do is first figure out if that person even necessarily recognizes it. Because, if there is negative behavior and things like that, sometimes it's actually more of a byproduct than it is the actual problem. So, for example, if you have someone that is, constantly being negative and, you can't do anything to please them, and getting to the bottom of where that's coming from might be an important thing. It might have to do with something that you can help with. It might have to do with something actually work related, or it might have something completely that doesn't have anything to do with work, and it's actually just coming out there. So I think sometimes, none of us are perfect. None of us are, super energetic and happy and, loving every minute of every day. But I don't think we always know the way that we affect others and the way that we come off. This individual might think, hey, I'm just being sarcastic and funny, and it's like, well, no one's perceiving you that way. So it could be a lot of different things, but really figuring out, one, if the person realizes that that's what they're doing in terms of that behavior, if they realize they're doing it, and two, maybe figuring out exactly what is underlying that.
Yeah, because it's really hard for people to separate work from home. I mean, if you can do that, let me know how that happens, because we're the same person and just carrying it from one place to the other means it's going to get brought up in either place. So, but how to bring up the conversation then as a manager or an owner, how do you get it to the point where maybe this is a the topic or the issue is something that we could essentially set on a table and observe both from a separate perspective, I'm imagining it might go along the lines of, hey, so-and-so mentioned that it really hurts when you say these kinds of things to them. Is that I don't assume that's your intention to make her feel that way. I mean, how would you approach something like that?
I think you're making a really good point. You speak to the behavior and not the intention. So again, maybe they're saying something and they don't mean to be mean. Well, if that's the case, then you're going to make them feel even worse by, being like, you're being rude. Versus I think some of the things you're saying might be, misinterpreted by your coworkers, where are these things coming from, kind of thing, versus, you're making people uncomfortable or you're saying hurtful things. That's different than speaking to a pattern of behavior over speaking to why they might be doing it. Don't speak to their intention, speak to what they're doing.
Oh yeah, you don't want to assume their intention. In other words, you want to just simply say, here is the behavior and it's making others feel this way, without going so far as to say you meant to do blank, you meant to hurt them, you meant to be mean. And so keeping it as objective as possible without labeling, I assume.
Yes.
I gotcha. And then what about other situations? In the article you talked about unjustified requests, and maybe asking for time off that's not allowed. What kind of insight could you give us there?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is also trying not to take things personally. I think it's one of the best lessons that I learned when I was teaching middle school before I went back to PT school. Because if you teach middle school, you can't take anything personally. Oof. But a lot of times when you get a request and you're like, well, that's not justified at all. That's where are they coming from? Well, that's the thing. They're coming from somewhere. You got to figure out where they're coming from, because nobody, goes and asks for things that they don't think they deserve. So it's kind of having that conversation. And then, if it's a request and you're like, that's just not something that can happen, you need to support why that can't happen, or what needs to happen in order for that to be a thing. If somebody's requesting a raise or requesting an excessive amount of time off and things like that, then again, they think on some level that it's a possibility. So you need to either discuss why it really isn't a possibility or discuss how to make it one.
Yeah, I've had that with a couple of clients this year who are now doing annual reviews of some of their employees and providers. And the providers are asking for raises, and it's a really hard time to authorize a raise in early 2021, as we're still lingering in the pandemic and considering what owners have gone through this past year. And so it's been imperative to talk to them about, talk to the owners about helping the employees understand what's really happened this past year that they might not have seen, like how much money you may have lost. You don't have to spit out numbers, but I didn't make a profit this year. There were times I didn't take a salary. And so it's been hard, not just for a lot of individuals, but for companies as well. Simply brushing it off and saying it's not going to happen isn't going to cut it. And they're being transparent again, kind of back to that.
Yeah. And from that standpoint, it is understandable once you sit down and you hear that from you or from whoever you're speaking to, like, oh, I kind of get that. But at the same time, you want to give them some validation for what they're asking. So maybe they are a great employee and you're just not in a place to, give a raise right now. Or, maybe they're an okay employee, and if they do something else, then they would be justified. But, giving a concrete, like, hey, it's not a good time now. I do really value you. Let's follow up in 3 or 4 months. Let's set a meeting and let's see where we're at financially then. Let's see how everything's going then. Because then it's really like, if what you're saying, it's not a good time right now. It's not, in terms of where, a lot of places are at. But that doesn't mean that, it's never going to happen, or things are never going to be better. But if you just say, no, now's not a good time, it kind of leaves you like, well, okay. what now? So if you can,
Yeah.
if you can at least validate that concern or that request, and sometimes you will have to push it off till some other time. But if you make an intention to discuss it at a later date, I think that goes a long way with at least fostering that relationship.
Yeah, I think that would be huge. Not just brushing it off, but say, hey, now's not a good time. Can we come back around in the middle of the year, or in, like you said, 3 to 4 months? But I also love what you said about, you know what, maybe a salary, a request for a raise isn't appropriate at this time. Let me show you some of the things that you could do here in the next little bit to really justify an increase in salary, so that they're not left wondering, oh, okay, I don't know what to do next. My salary request just got rejected. Now what do I do? You don't want to leave them hanging and like that. You want to give them some concrete insight, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but man, people want that feedback. They kind of want the scorecard. They want the report card. Where am I doing well? Where am I doing poorly? Right.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I think so much of, like, you figure PTs go to school like forever. There's so many, practicals, and everything has a rubric, and you need to do X, Y, and Z, and you get an A, and we thrive off of that, and we get so used to that. And then you get out into your career and you're like, I have no idea how I'm doing. Like, that patient told me they're worse, and then the other patient told me they're better, and I have no idea, how I'm doing. Like, it's very, those like kind of things to ground you a little bit are very important, and they give you something to work towards.
Yeah, something you brought up in the article is you call consistent openness. So tell me about that.
So consistent openness, it goes to the transparency a little bit, but then it also goes to just trying to have a well-rounded relationship in general. You want to focus on your people that you have, and then everything else should fall into place. Okay. If you're like keeping it strictly business and strictly one-sided, it's very hard to really develop that trust between different people. Being open means, sharing vulnerable things or explaining, your motives behind things, but constantly giving feedback and constantly getting feedback helps everybody kind of figure out where they are and how the relationship's going.
And I guess that's you're completely unable to do that unless you're having some structured meetings. Right? I mean, in where you're at, do you have a regular meeting schedule?
We have like our like a bi-weekly meeting every other week, and then we also have one-on-one meetings that happen monthly, and those are more informal, more of like a check-in between like those big reviews and things like that. Because if you just sit down once a year, it's like nobody knows what's going on in life. Nobody knows what's going on. It's like, I'm at least in a very large clinic. There's a lot of us. It might be easier in a smaller one, but constant check-ins with each other is pretty big, and just to know what's going on in all aspects.
Yeah, and I think that's huge. A lot of owners might shy away from meetings because they are seen as quote unquote unproductive, or they hear the book Death by Meeting and think that meetings altogether are wrong or something like that. But this is exactly the time where a leader can stand up and say, these are the numbers that we're seeing. This is what's happening in the clinic. This is what's happening during the pandemic and how we're addressing it. Team members want to hear that stuff on a regular basis, right? And you can't do that unless you have some structured meetings, right?
Yeah, and like you said, like being open about things. If you're not having meetings, or you're not having those points where you can really communicate, people are going to communicate whether they have the correct information or not. Like, you want them to have the information to talk about. They'll find some. I mean, that's what happens. But the more open you are and the more forward you are with what's going on, the more that people feel secure, and the less that they start to create their own ideas.
Yeah. And you said your one-on-one meetings are somewhat free flowing, but what's the general undertone, or what are you guys really trying to get at in those one-on-one meetings?
The one-on-one meetings are really designed to check in with like the numbers and things like that, not from a, this is what you need to do, but this is where you are. I hope you're aware of where you are right now. And then also just to see where you're at more from like a headspace standpoint. Like, are you, is it a point where, you're rocking and rolling and patients are coming in, you're feeling good? Or is it one of those times where you feel like, you're struggling? And a lot can come out in those meetings. Like sometimes you might have somebody that's, their numbers aren't as good. And when you start getting to it, you recognize that it's coming from like lack of confidence, or, they're at a point where they've had a lot of tough patients and that starts weighing on you. So you can kind of get those feelings out in the open. And one of the things you'll recognize, like everybody feels that way at some point. Nobody feels 100%, 100% of the time in the clinic. That'd be amazing. You will have some of those days, but you also have some of those days where you're like, oh my goodness, like, I don't know if I'm good.
Yeah. And as a team member, does it give you some confidence knowing that you have that monthly scheduled meeting? Like I'm assuming that maybe things come up during the month that you feel like you want to address. Does it give you some confidence knowing that, hey, this is something that I want to address at my next one-on-one?
Yeah. And it prevents you from letting those things go on. It's like almost like a point where it's like, I have my opportunity to talk about the things that I want to talk about, so I can, versus, not having it scheduled, or like having one here and having one there. Like you don't necessarily have a place where you can talk and where you can, voice concerns. And a month goes by so quick. I mean, there are some months where you're like, didn't we just do this? And there's other months where a lot happen in between, but I think that's the cool part of it too.
Well, to make those successful, I know we might be getting into the weeds a little bit, but do you have your meetings scheduled like the third Thursday of every month, or is it kind of routine like that?
Yeah, like yeah. So it's like it's usually the similar time and similar day, unless obviously things come up and things like that. But for the most part, yeah, it's like the same weekday of the same on the month.
That's awesome. And that, like I said, that just kind of gives you some comfort, some confidence, and knowing that your voice will be heard.
Yeah. And it goes a long way. If there is something that bothers you, you're like, oh, I'll bring it up at my meeting. And then you can almost like let it go a little bit rather than thinking like, nothing's going to get solved. I'm just, so it does help. And sometimes you have things to talk about and sometimes you don't.
I love those meetings as well in terms of accountability, because I'm sure you're a great team player, but in my past, there are instances where this great team player all of a sudden starts falling off a little bit. And then we have to scramble to get a meeting together with them. And usually we find out there was something outside of work that's severely affecting their ability to perform. And it's easy to have those conversations when you say, hey, help us understand what's going on. You were seeing these kind of numbers before, and now you're here. There's a really big, how can we help you? What's going on? And having those conversations can really help a lot. But I wish we had been a little bit more diligent about having the structured routine one-on-one meetings to have those conversations.
Yeah, you get a really good appreciation for what other people have going on, and especially this past year.
Yeah, exactly.
People have a lot going on.
It's really cool that you really highlight the 5 areas in which you can have these conversations. They include discussions about finances, performance, behavior, requests, and logistics. Anything more you have to say about either one of those topics specifically?
Not necessarily any one specifically, but also recognizing that sometimes who you are in the conversation, sometimes you have to be a little bit different part of yourself. So I think a big thing is like, you'll have some people that are more serious that you talk to. You'll have some people that are, joke around more. You'll have some people that love to share their feelings, and you'll have other people that is like the most painful thing for them to do. And I think we can find different parts of ourselves to connect with people in that way. If you have somebody that absolutely they don't like talking about their feelings, well, you don't want to start the meeting like, with one of the hardest questions about, how they feel and things like that. But there are different ways to do it. And like being able to know your team and know who you're talking to can go a long way with all these conversations. Yeah,
I remember Steve Anderson gave a presentation about this at one of the PPS webinars recently, and he had some bricks on his table with different colors because those different colors related to certain personality types. And he knew which type of personality type was the person that was going to come in to see him next. So if it was someone who was kind of low tone and didn't want to talk about their emotions that much, then he would look at the brick and like, that's right. They're going to be like this. And so I should have these kind of questions ready, or I should address him in this certain way versus this person who's going to come in super energetic. All they want is the data. They don't want to talk about emotions. They just want data. How am I doing? And what do I need to do to improve and get out? I mean, when you know their personality types, it helps the conversation go along so much better. Is that something, have you used personality tests in the past and whatnot?
Yeah, we use strength finders is a big one, and Enneagram. So that kind of helps figure out, it's so enlightening when you figure out what somebody is and you're like, oh, that's why they're so different than I am. You know, like I am very like futuristic and like thinking in ideals. And then there's other people that are like, no, I'm like analytical, like give me the steps and I will go. And I'm like, tell me where I need to be and I'll figure out how to get there on my own. You know, so knowing that difference is really important, because if you give me step by step, I'm going to be like, oh, okay. And if I gave, oh, you just have to accomplish B, somebody else will be like, well, now I have no idea what to do. So recognizing who you're speaking with is definitely a big part of the conversation.
Yeah. Is Strength Finders, is that an Enneagram platform?
Strength Finders is a book, and then within it, you like it's a pretty comprehensive thing, and it gives you like 5 strengths, and then there are like probably like 50 or 60 strengths within it.
Sure. Yeah, and then a lot of people will rely on the Myers-Briggs. That's kind of been an old standby as well, and so I think it's imperative that leaders, wherever they are, whether they're clinic directors or the owners themselves, have some of that in their files to really help them understand the people that they're talking to and who they're working with.
Yeah, I definitely think that helps a lot.
That's cool. Well, anything else you want to share that we haven't discussed thus far, as in terms of having these crossroad conversations and what therapists and owners can do to improve the team dynamic?
Yeah, I think my biggest message with the entire thing is that these conversations are not a burden. They're an opportunity. They're an opportunity to make the relationship better. And, start looking at it that way, because eventually they get a little bit easier. They never get easy, but they get a little bit easier, and you'll be surprised how well you can come out of the conversations and move forward. So I think, a big point in nearly every communication book you read is to do it more and to do it often.
Yeah, it's like a muscle that hasn't been worked before. As physical therapists, that should be an easy analogy to understand. Is the more we can work that muscle, the stronger it's going to be, and the more confident we're going to be in it. Just like when we were newly graduated physical therapists, the confidence level wasn't there until we performed 1,000 initial evaluations on a shoulder. And we can feel much more confident at that point moving forward. The same thing is with these crucial conversations that we can have with our employees, and that as we do them, we can start understanding, we can start seeing cues, we can start gaining some buy-in from teammates the more we hold these.
I agree.
Cool. Well, if anyone wants to get in touch with you, Jenna, and what you guys are doing at Professional Rebellion, how do we do that?
Best would be to email me. It's Jenna Gourlay. So will you put it on there or spell it out?
Yeah, Jenna. Go ahead.
Gourlay at gmail.com is the best way. And then you can find Professional Rebellion at physiorebellion.com, and that's where Phil and I do a lot there.
Cool. And do you have some webinars or some videos to share?
We have some webinars. We have different, we obviously have a blog that you can look at, but different quizzes and things that you can kind of take to help you figure out exactly what your ideal career is in physical therapy. Because we get so much in school, we know exactly, what we want to do on an eval, but then when it comes to our career, 5, 10, 20 years down the road, we might have absolutely no idea what we want that to look like. And it can be, you can, just go through the motions, or you can, really create something that is so exciting and you look forward to going to work every day.
That sounds like it's such a great resource for physical therapists out there because I know burnout is an issue when you simply see the lack of people age 60, 70 that are still treating full time.
Hmm.
It's kind of a young
Yeah.
person's sport, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's important to recognize what that purpose is early on so you can
Hmm.
start moving that direction and accelerating the path to it.
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. Well, thanks for your time today. Really
Yeah.
appreciate it. Thanks for your work in professional rebellion and the article itself. Ton of
Thanks.
great information, and I hopefully people reach out and lean on you more.
Awesome. I appreciate you having me.
All right. Thanks.